The tent steadily became more substantial and comfortable until by the early 1860s, they started to give way to the famous gingerbread cottages that you can still see today, over 300 of them, what the architectural historian Ellen Weiss has called a new American building type, the campground cottage. As I said, there's over 300 of those cottages that still stand today on our grounds. They range anywhere from 140 to 170 years old. Over 170 years old. The campground is one of the most magical places in the world. And so if you're not already a friend and visitor, I encourage you to come and enjoy the place. Now let's turn to the subject of today's presentation, and that's going to start with this slide of this interesting group assembled at what was called the speaker's stand. This was before the Iron Tabernacle was built in 1879. It was still called the Tabernacle, but from 1871 through 1878, it was a massive canvas tent that was erected to cover the audience, and the clergy gathered at the speaker's stand. It's in exactly the same spot, the speaker's stand, as the stage of the Tabernacle today. This photo was most likely taken in the late 1860s. And the grouping and attire of the people suggests that those standing behind the lectern are clergy, and those seated in front of them, the lectern, were laymen. And even at this early date, you can see some brown faces in both groups, here among the clergy, as well as this distinguished gentleman among the laymen. We know who some of the faces in the crowd are, not many, but we do know who this gentleman was. This was Dr. Samuel Birmingham, Dr. Samuel Till Birmingham. He was a botanic physician who resided in New Bedford and had offices in both New Bedford and Boston. He identified as both Black and Native American. Birmingham was born March 1, 1800 in Delaware and died of old age in 1896. He outlived 2 wives. He had 8 children by the first and 9 by the second. Birmingham's maternal grandfather, Francis Freeman, was a Native American who served in the Revolutionary War as a scout for General Washington and was still drawing a pension in 1834 when he passed away at the age of 109. Dr. Birmingham shows up as a campground resident in the earliest lease records of the MVCMA. He had a tent on the grounds in 1862, which was the first year that lease records were kept. Or I should say it was the first year for which we still have lease records in our records. But he was already 62 then, and it's likely that he was attending the camp meeting even earlier than that. In the mid-19th century, Birmingham was one of the wealthier residents of New Bedford at a time when New Bedford was the richest city per capita in the world, owing to its prominence in the whaling industry. Birmingham had the cottage at number 3 Forest Circle built for him in 1865. It's one of the earlier and more important of the campground cottages. It was one of the first 50 cottages built. The cottage still survives today. Worth a visit. It actually looks better now than it did in this picture because it's undergone a significant restoration in the past few years. But this is very likely the first Black-owned cottage in all of Oak Bluffs. And remember that we're talking about 1865. At that point, Oak Bluffs outside the campground didn't even exist. Wouldn't even exist on the drafting table of Robert Morris Copeland until the following year. But Birmingham didn't stay in the campground very long. By 1871, he would sell his campground cottage and move to a grander cottage that he had built for him in the Highlands on Beecher Park. And that cottage also still survives. This was an extraordinary man, and I'm working on an article focused on him that will appear in a future issue of the Museum Quarterly. Perhaps our most prominent resident and another very early cottage owner of color was the Reverend William Jackson. Jackson, who also lived in New Bedford, was a minister, a friend and contemporary of Frederick Douglass, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and one of the first Black officers in the U.S. Army. Skip Finley had a nice article on Reverend Jackson in the Martha's Vineyard magazine last year, and I hope you were able to visit the museum's recent exhibit on Jackson. The source of the information for the article and exhibit was Jackson's great-great-granddaughter, Valerie Craigwell White, who I'm honored is in attendance today, and who I'm very pleased has agreed to speak in the Tabernacle this summer. Valerie is currently writing the definitive biography of Reverend Jackson, and I'm eagerly awaiting its publication. Here's the cottage at 12 Central Avenue, which is near the northern limit of our grounds, just a few doors in from the entrance across the street from Nancy's. That's a local reference, obviously. Reverend Jackson rented 12 Central Avenue in 1870, the year it was built, and purchased it in 1871. As you can see from this contemporary photograph, that cottage also still survives. Now, whereas Birmingham had moved out of the campground by 1871, Jackson owned 12 Central Avenue until his death in 1900, after which it was owned by his daughter, Mary, until 1921. When Frederick Douglass visited the campground in 1876 and spoke at what was then the Canvas Tabernacle, he would have stayed with his friend, Reverend Jackson, at 12 Central Avenue. There's other examples of early residents of color who were, in some cases, merchants plying their trade during the summer months in the campground. One name that appears in the early lease records is Anthony Jourdain, who was, once again, a New Bedford resident. There's a very strong New Bedford connection in the campground's early history, and was a barber from Paramaribo, Suriname. There's also Robert H. Piper, who operated an ice cream tent and lodging house at the site of the current summer house, formerly the Wesley House. And he was a Black man from New Bedford, and Valerie is familiar with the history of his family. So we have this fascinating early history, and yet it's well known that the campground was essentially whites only for much of the 20th century. The stories of exclusion of people of color and the pain associated with that lives on to this day in the oral tradition of more than a few island families. But there was very little known documentation of those practices. And last year, I was asked to find such evidence as might still exist in our records and other sources. And I didn't expect to find much, really, because I assumed that if you practice racial discrimination, it's unlikely that you would document the practice. But I found a great deal more than I expected to, and in the process stumbled onto what I consider to be a much larger story and what might be the first seasonal community of color on the island. The qualifier seasonal is important here because, of course, the entire island was originally Wampanoag land before it was stolen from them. Well, let's take a look at the list of resolutions in these 1872 board minutes. It's sort of a laundry list of various and sundry things. Voted that the matter of police force for the present be left with the agent with power to act. Voted that the bill of Mrs. Worth for $7.89 be paid. Voted that the question of locating colored people be left with the agent. Well, that's an extraordinary statement, and all the more so because it appears in such a kind of mundane list of miscellaneous board resolutions. But in considering the import of that resolution in the context of the other evidence that's come to light, this is what I believe to be the correct interpretation of that resolution. Namely, as of 1872, the Camp Meeting Association did indeed lease tent and cottage lots to people of color, but it was understood that you would be assigned a lot in a location based, at least in part, on the color of your skin. And again, it's implicit in the statement. It really doesn't seem to have been a question of whether to segregate leaseholders of color from their white neighbors, but how to go about doing it. Another consideration is why now? I mean, this is 1872. And we know from the preceding material that there were leaseholders of color already for at least 10 years. What was it about 1872 that the board felt the need to make this resolution? And to me, the likeliest explanation is that prior to 1872, the number of leaseholders of color had been very few. And furthermore, some of them were quite prominent, as in the case of Reverend Jackson and Dr. Birmingham. And so it would make sense that by 1872, the number of Black leaseholders or leaseholders of color was increasing to the point that the board felt the need to announce this policy or to adopt this policy of allowing the agent to determine where people of color could lease a lot. So that was the earliest and one of the more significant findings in the old records of the association, in this case, the board minutes. Another one comes later in 1887, and it arose because a group of white leaseholders in the southern parts of Clinton and West Clinton Avenues petitioned the Camp Meeting Association because evidently there was a prospect of granting leases to people of color in that neighborhood, and they didn't want that to happen. And in response to that petition, the action taken by the association was to state that the association judged it improper and illegal to make distinctions among our tenants on the ground of color. Whether that comports with the practice is something that we will examine, but I will say that I haven't found any leaseholders of color on Clinton or West Clinton Avenue in the 19th century, or for that matter, in the 20th century prior to the 1980s. And so it appears that the petitioners ultimately achieved their objective, even though the sort of salutary declaration by the association would suggest otherwise. 2 years later, there's another incident where, and this is, I think, rather well known, at least I've heard people speak of it. And it's an incident in 1889 when the campground denied a lease to a Black applicant based on objections of a white neighbor to having a, quote, colored lodging house next door to him, close quote. And the neighbor in question was Ezekiel Matthews, who happened to be one of the same leaseholders who was a petitioner 2 years earlier. These two articles are interesting because the tone is very sympathetic to the position of the Camp Meeting Association, but they appear to be a kind of response or rebuttal to another article from the New Bedford Mercury that was evidently more critical, but I haven't been able to locate it. It's also interesting that the longer of the two articles quotes in full the resolution made by the Camp Meeting Association 2 years earlier, which is interesting in the sense that our board minutes are not public documents. And even today, a leaseholder has to go through a couple of hurdles in order to view them. So it suggests again that the statement of 2 years prior, the resolution of 2 years prior, may have been sincerely held, but it was also evidently done, at least in part, for public relations purposes. The articles, in addition to chronicling this incident of exclusion, also are interesting for a couple of very important clues. There's a reference to a, quote, colony of colored people about Wesleyan Grove, close quote. And in the longer article, an especially tantalizing reference to there being, quote, not less than 25 lots leased to colored people on their premises, close quote. That's a substantial number, and so far as I know, that's never been determined what that, where those leaseholders were or where that number came from. So again, where were the not less than 25 lots leased to people of color? In examining the records of the association, there is a report from 1904, which is probably the single most illuminating piece of evidence found so far. The author of the report was the agent and treasurer of the association, Edmund G. Eldridge. I gather he's largely ran the association for the better part of 30 years, from 1895 until his death in 1926. And the excerpts that are on this slide from his report, again, they show up on page 4 or 5 of a lengthy report that's talking about various and sundry mundane issues. And it continues with the part that's on the screen saying the number of leaseholders is 387, one cottage removed, one new one built. The general condition of the cottages on the grounds improves each year. The lower portion of our grounds has been given up to the occupation of colored people. It will be remembered that a number of years ago, a row of these houses were removed from the rear of Clinton Avenue, and from time to time, some of them have been sold and removed for non-payment of rent and unsightly appearance. There's still a number of these shanties in bad repair, and while a radical change involving an order for the removal of all these buildings would not be practical or advisable, there are certain features connected with them that I shall ask the committee to consider before our May meeting. Thank you for indulging me reading something that you're already capable of reading yourself, but it's very important. It might remind you of being at back to school night, but this is a key to to unraveling what I've been able to unravel thus far. The language of this report is quite vivid, or maybe, I don't know, pungent might be a better word, because the only common characteristic of what Eldridge is referring to as these houses, these shanties, those buildings, is that they were owned by people of color rather than anything intrinsic to the structures themselves. But there's also some important clues here as to the location of this early community of color, specifically the reference to having removed cottages, quote, from the rear of Clinton Avenue, close quote, as well as the reference to, quote, the lower portion of our grounds. Now in 1904, when that report was written, the street that would have been to the rear of Clinton Avenue was Wamsutta Avenue. And this is a different Wamsutta Avenue than the Wamsutta Avenue that still exists in the Copeland district. The campground once had its own Wamsutta Avenue. It was eliminated in 1910, as we'll touch on. But to this day, the parking lot at the corner of Dukes County Avenue and School Street still bears its name. It's the Wamsutta lot. So in this excerpt of the 1887 Sanborn Fire Insurance Map, you can see that there are about a dozen cottages on Wamsutta Avenue at the time. So you can see School Street running vertically to the far right, and then Dukes County Avenue north would be to the right and south would be to the left. Wamsutta Avenue parallel to Dukes County, and not visible in the excerpt is Clinton Avenue, parallel to Wamsutta on the lower side of the image. Our lease records list the names and hometowns of the cottage owners, but not their race. But what I found is that knowing the name and hometown is often enough information with a little trial and error to identify those same individuals in the federal census records, which do indicate race, at least in the judgment of the census taker. And in doing that exercise for the cottage owners on Wamsutta Avenue in 1887, it turns out that nearly all of those dozen or so cottages on Wamsutta Avenue were owned by people of color. That was a considerable revelation. It doesn't get us to our target in terms of a community of not less than 25 leaseholders, because that's, as I say, it was about a dozen cottages on Wamsutta Avenue. Now, there's a very rich photographic history of early Oak Bluffs, but there's almost no known photographs of the former Wamsutta Avenue. Here is one, though, and it shows the cottage that once stood at 16 Wamsutta Avenue. This image is from one of a group of glass negatives that I've had for about 6 years, but I did not initially know where it was. There's some writing, marginal notation on the glass negative, and it reads Allen Singers, and it's also dated, which is nice. It's not unusual for the glass negatives to be dated, but most of them weren't. And the date on this one is August 3 of 1883. But I've never found any reference to the Allen Singers then or since, and the date didn't mean a great deal in isolation. Of course, the house number 16 is also clearly legible. So what we had initially was a picture taken in 1883 of an unidentified cottage somewhere in Oak Bluffs with the house number 16 and 4 young men standing on the porch. Well, that kind of a puzzle is like catnip to me and my 2 similarly obsessed friends, and it was one of them, not me, who gets credit for figuring out that this was 16 Wamsutta Avenue, despite that there were at least 15 other cottages with the house number 16 in the campground alone, and despite the fact that Wamsutta Avenue hasn't even existed for over a century. Here, 16 Wamsutta Avenue is highlighted on that same 1887 Sanborn Fire Insurance Map excerpt. But we don't know as of now, or at this point, we still didn't know who were the 4 young men standing on the porch of the cottage. And again, I've never found any reference to the Allen Singers elsewhere. But here is where good fortune and elbow grease came into play, because a newspaper article surfaced that sheds more light on the question. In particular, the August 12, 1883 Boston Herald. Well, that was a Sunday. So the Sunday edition of the Boston Herald in that era would frequently have a column on Cottage City with various items, little news item entries, almost like a gossip column saying who had arrived at which cottage and so on. And so in that column for this edition of the Boston Herald, there's one entry that says, a quartet of colored students from Howard University sung at the Tabernacle morning and afternoon last Sunday. So last Sunday relative to August 12th of 1883 would have been August 5th of 1883. You remember that our picture is dated August 3rd of 1883, the Friday prior. So the young men were a quartet of singers from Howard University visiting Martha's Vineyard. There's more pieces that fall into place and sort of illustrates the process involved in some of this research, because we know from our lease records that the owner of 16 Wamsutta Avenue at the time was Jeremiah Smith of Providence. And despite Smith being a common last name, it is possible to identify him in the federal census records and determine that he was a Black man who lived in Providence with his family. Furthermore, Smith's wife, Eliza, was born in Washington, D.C., and they had sons. And in 1883, one of their sons would have been the right age to have been a student at Howard University. So he may be one of the singers. That's speculative, but it's also probably true. So this image is remarkable for a number of reasons, not least that is by far the earliest documented connection between Howard University and Martha's Vineyard. Go Bisons. Wamsutta Avenue, as I mentioned before, does not entirely account for, or it doesn't even account for half of the supposed not less than 25 lots that were said to have been leased to people of color in the earlier newspaper articles that we looked at. And we still have not identified what Eldridge meant by the, quote, the lower portion of our grounds, close quote. At first, I thought that might refer to the southernmost part of the grounds, which was the region where the group of white leaseholders had earlier objected to leases being granted to people of color. But as I mentioned, so far as I can tell, there never were people of color in that part of the campground in the 19th century or even for most of the 20th century. But you can also see on this same Sanborn map excerpt, again, 1887, that in addition to the dozen cottages along Wamsutta Avenue, west of them or upward in the direction of the image, there's about 18 cottages along that stretch of Dukes County Avenue south of School Street. A lot of people don't realize that the west side of Dukes County Avenue in this stretch is even part of the campground, but it is. It was then and it still is today. It's also topographically the lowest part of our grounds, because if you are at all familiar with the area, you know that every time there's a heavy rain, there's still significant standing water that accumulates there at the intersection of Dukes County Avenue and School Street. So let's look at some of our lease records then for these cottages along this campground stretch of Dukes County Avenue. Here's a page of our lease records. Again, Dukes County Avenue, I selected the year 1887 because that's the same year as in the Sanborn map that we've been referring to. You see the list of, in this case, about 20 leaseholders, and certain common characteristics sort of jump out at you. Nearly all the leaseholders are women. Most of them are from New Bedford. And again, from the campground records, we have just names and hometowns, but when you do the same exercise of cross-referencing this information with federal and state census data, find again that all of these cottages were owned by people of color. Give you an illustration of, or a condensed version of how that process looks like. You see, here's Violet Armstead of New Bedford in our 1887 lease records has a cottage at 2 Dukes County Avenue. She also appears in the 1880 federal census for New Bedford. And there we can see that she was a Black woman born in Virginia about 1829. But in addition to that, and beyond the primary sources, I have the benefit of reference to works by real historians. One of the more notable ones being The Fugitives Gibraltar by Catherine Grover, which is a really important book that kind of chronicles the place of New Bedford in US history in the mid-19th century. And it's quite a place of honor in terms of it having been one of the principal destinations on the Underground Railroad. If you were fleeing enslavement and you made it to New Bedford, you were not going back, because notwithstanding the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, it was not enforced in New Bedford, could not be enforced in New Bedford. There's newspaper editorials from that era where they are really thumbing their nose at the federal government saying, sure, send your slave catchers up here, let's see how well they do. But Violet Armstead, like a number of the other Dukes County leaseholders, can be found in Ms. Grover's book. And in the case of Violet Armstead, she is identified as having fled enslavement in 1854 from Portsmouth, Virginia. It's also interesting to me, this is 1880, so it's, you know, post-bellum and all, but it says she was born in Virginia. Even the census entries, federal census entries for 1850 and 1860 are identifying these people of color living in New Bedford who had fled enslavement and identifying their state of birth accurately as Virginia, South Carolina, Maryland, what have you, which to me at least underscored the comparative safety of New Bedford, because if I had fled enslavement and the census taker and made it to New Bedford and the census taker was knocking on my door in 1850 and asked me where I was born, I'd probably say Vermont or New Hampshire or something. I don't think I'd say I was born in Virginia, but that I think is an indication of the comparative safety that formerly enslaved people felt when they were able to reach New Bedford. So now we've got these cottages identified, 12 in, give or take 12 in Wamsutta Avenue, 18 along Dukes County Avenue. So really this is that community rediscovered. Now this is about 30 cottages in total. On this, again, same, well, it's not the same excerpt because now you can see a little bit of Clinton Avenue too, running parallel to Wamsutta and Dukes County. But on this excerpt, the Dukes County cottages are colored blue and the Wamsutta cottages are colored yellow. So this was a substantial community, and it's remarkable that it existed. It's remarkable that its existence has been forgotten for decades. It's remarkable that the Camp Meeting Association did its utmost from the late, let's say the 1890s through 19-teens to exclude leaseholders of color from its grounds. But most remarkable of all is the heroism of the people who own these cottages and what they overcame in their lives to be able to do that. Then the stories of these families are still just very early beginning to be developed. If I go back to our list of leaseholders, there's names, there are still names on the island today. Julia Smalley was Gayhead, then Wampanoag, who owned 19 Dukes County Avenue for a couple of years. One of her children was Amos Peters Smalley, the famous Gayhead harpooner who was credited with being the only person ever to kill a white whale. But I mean, all up and down the line, and I've only just started to scratch the surface, the stories and the family histories are astonishing. So as I mentioned, the east side of Wamsutta Avenue was cleared by the association in 1895, and that's confirmed by a subsequent Sanborn map, as well as the board minutes. The fuller explanation will be in this article that I've written that's coming out in the next issue of the Martha's Vineyard Museum Quarterly. In 1895, clearing the east side of Wamsutta Avenue did not entail excluding those leaseholders from the grounds. Those cottages were just pushed out further to the west, pushed to the west side of Wamsutta Avenue, and in some cases to Duke County Avenue. But then 1910 was the year that the campground eliminated Wamsutta Avenue in its entirety. And by then, the number of cottages on Duke County Avenue had also dwindled significantly more by attrition. So far, we've identified with certainty only one cottage that survived this purge of Wamsutta Avenue, and it survived it. Actually, it was moved twice in the 1890. It was initially on the east side of Wamsutta Avenue, which is the lower side in this image. In 1895, it was moved to the west side. Then in 1910, it was moved across the street to the west side of Dukes County Avenue, where it still is today. And it also stayed in the same family for many decades. I believe it was the only Black-owned cottage in the campground for much of the 20th century. But again, it was in a location that even today, a lot of people don't realize is part of the campground because it's on the west side of Dukes County Avenue, and it's at the very western fringe of our grounds. This is an aerial view from a drone. And in this, you can see Dukes County Avenue extending south toward the top of the image and School Street going off to the right. And it's just a drone picture taken on one day last summer, but it still has a couple of features of interest. For one, you can see the cottage that I was referring to. It's currently number 9 Dukes County Avenue. but it used to be originally on the east side of Wamsutta, then moved to the west side of Wamsutta. And as I said, it stayed in the same family until the 1970s. You also notice there we are at the corner of Dukes County and School Street, and guess what? There's standing water there, as there often is, because just like in 1904, it is indeed the lower portion of our grounds. Here we have your drone operator assisted by his chief engineer. And then the last feature of interest in this photograph is it's hard to see, but there's a rather large boulder there in the Wamsutta lot, and its positioning is fortuitous because with reference to the other Sanborn fire insurance map, it was pretty much right in the middle of this community that has been rediscovered. And the reason I call that boulder to your attention is it's going to be sandblasted and the surrounding area spruced up. But this will be the location of a new site on the Martha's Vineyard African American Heritage Trail to commemorate this former community. It's the first, it'll be the first African American Heritage Trail site in the campground. We're very proud of that and very honored to be working in partnership with Elaine Weintraub and all the wonderful people in her organization to help make sure that this story gets told, never again forgotten. Specifically, if you want to mark your calendars, the dedication ceremony for this new trail site is going to be on June 24th of this year. It's the Friday at 5:30 p.m. And that boulder will, after being cleaned up and the surroundings spruced up, will have not one but two plaques. One plaque being a narrative where the African American Heritage Trail of Martha's Vineyard and the Martha's Vineyard Camp Meeting Association jointly honor these early campground residents of color. But the second plaque being a list of 40 names, and these are names of leaseholders who occupied these cottages at one time or another during their existence from the early 1870s until the 19-teens, when, with the one exception I noted, they were all gone. So that is what I wanted to share with you today. There's more information in the article that is in press and soon to be published, and I hope you'll also read that, as it might contain additional information of interest. With that, I'm happy to, we have plenty of time for some questions. I don't know whether anyone has them, but I'm going to stop screen sharing and then address any questions.
Thank you, Andrew. That has been absolutely outstanding, and we are very much looking forward to the publication of the next issue of the quarterly to read more about your research. We do have 3 questions that have been entered into the Q&A since the presentation began. One question about one of the terms that you used. Is the agent a campground official?
Oh, that's a great question. Today, the agent was a lot of things in the old days. Today, we don't use the term agent, but our executive director or general manager might be the person who is on site to kind of keep the trains running on time. In this case, in that era, this fellow, Edmund Eldridge, performed that role, but in addition, he was a board member and an officer of the association. He was a year-round resident, Eldridge was, and coincidentally lived on Wamsutta Avenue, not the one in the campground, but in the Copeland district, and was an insurance agent.
All right, thank you. Additional questions from earlier in the presentation. Do we know who and how many camp meeting members were on the board? How did they come to be on the board? By election?
Oh, we do. I mean, in the board minutes year by year, one of the orders of business is to elect new members for members whose term has expired. I'm not sure, we didn't even have term limits until relatively recently. And I'm glad we do now, but we didn't then. So for example, Eldridge was a board member for over 30 years, and we had other board members who similarly served very long tenures. But whenever there was a board member who needed to be replaced, there would be an election by the association. And initially, the board members tended to be ministers, and then more and more they became lay people. But in any event, then as now, the board members are elected by the association itself.
And at the time, were they all men?
Yes, they were certainly all men. I don't know when we had our first woman board member. It was before my time. When I joined the board, we had a woman president, in fact. But it's been, I would think, within the past probably, I shouldn't speculate, but it's been, I'd say no more recent than the 1980s, but I could be corrected by someone with a longer institutional memory than mine.
Sure. So. Are any of the campground cottages that were relocated to the Copeland district identified as formerly Black owned?
Not that I know of, because when you say campground cottages relocated to the Copeland district, by and large, I mean, there are a number. And a lot of people in the Copeland district who have a campground looking cottage assume that it came from the campground, which is not always the case. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it was just built where it stands in the campground style. And people who people moved out of the campground all the time back in that era. Maybe they wanted to own the land. Maybe they didn't like all of our rules. Those are still considerations today. You don't own the land, and we still have a lot of rules, and not everyone likes that. But so if a cottage was moved out of the campground, you know, the starting assumption should be that it was voluntary on the part of the cottage owner. In the case of these Black-owned cottages, I don't know of any instances of them having been moved to the Copeland district. It seems like the direction of migration or exodus, or whatever you want to call it, in the case of the cottages owned by people of color, was more the other direction, up the hill on School Street, you know, toward the library and the town hall in that neighborhood, where again, there's a lot of long history of Black families owning cottages. And I don't think that's entirely unconnected with the campground history. I think it's all of a piece.
Sure. Other questions? I'm going to step away from the Q&A for just a moment and look at what's going on in our chat. We've got a lot of excellent commentary happening. Do we know why the leaseholders that you mentioned were predominantly female?
No, that's a great question, and I don't know. I don't know the answer. I've speculated on it to some extent. You know, it may have been that the men were staying on the mainland to work, or for whatever reason. It may have been that the women were considered more palatable lessees to the association, somehow, you know, less threatening or better educated or what, I don't know. But I really don't know the reason, but it's not a uniform situation. They're not all women, but so many of them are women. There has to be some reason for that, or some combination of reasons.
Sure. And a situation like that would obviously be a lot of speculation unless other primary source documents were to suddenly turn up, which of course, as historians, we always hope they do. But sometimes they're just frustratingly hidden in the annals of time. Another question, and it seems to be a common topic. Have you, as part of your research, contacted any of the descendants of people you've identified as being cottage owners on either Dukes County or Wamsutta Avenue?
Not specifically the descendants, because I haven't gone that far to the present day to be able to identify the descendants, but I've had a number of great conversations with families that have stories of having been excluded from the campground. And, that oral tradition is very compelling. And I've also, had a conversation with a wonderful woman who bought a cottage on Rock Avenue in the campground in the 1970s, Black lady who owned it for a few years. But at the time, she was told she was the first and only cottage owner of color in the campground. And of course, she never thought she was the first. And we know now she wasn't the first, but at the time, she might very well have been the only one.
Sure. A lot of questions also regarding what, if anything, more we know about the Wampanoag people who were owners or lessees in this period that we're talking about in campground history. Do we have any further information about them, or are you planning on making them a focus of your further and continuing research?
Well, I mean, their stories are part of this, because you have the family histories of these cottage owners. It's not either or in terms of being African American or Wampanoag. It's frequently all of the above, and they're families that are, intermarried or mixed, African American and Wampanoag, and there's a number of those families among these groups. And in the article that's coming out, I've identified a little bit more of the family histories, but that research is still in the very early stages. So another article, sure. I mean, it's not in the works right now, but there's certainly a whole lot of material there that hasn't been discovered yet.
Excellent. And it seems as though everyone would like to be able to get in touch with you about additional questions. Would you be willing to put some kind of contact information in the chat so that anybody who has questions like this one about information about a particular house could get in touch with you?
Yep. I will put my Hotmail, my email, my personal
Excellent.
email. And yeah, anyone who wants to contact me with questions is welcome to. We can't, and as I say, I have two very good friends who are cohorts in a lot of the general Oak Bluffs research that I've been kind of obsessed with, and they are similarly obsessed with. And we like to figure out these kind of things the way my friend figured out that picture was 16 Wamsutta Avenue. So whoever figures out a particularly challenging puzzle then gets bragging rights until the next one rolls around.
Excellent. All right, if everyone can see, Andrew has been kind enough to put his email address right in the chat box, but if you're not reading along, the address is A as in Andrew, J as in John, Patch, P-A-T-C-H, @hotmail.com. And if you have additional questions for him, please feel free to reach out. It really has been an outstanding afternoon. This has been a wonderful presentation. We here at the museum are really grateful to you for your time and your attention and your willingness to be here with us this afternoon. And we are looking forward to the next article in the quarterly and any others that might come as your research continues. And I would like to thank everybody who has joined us this afternoon. The session was recorded, and we will be offering that recording as soon as we can get it sort of tidied up and ready for post-production airing. And we appreciate everyone tuning in for this very important part of our Black History Month celebration here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum. I hope you all have a very excellent afternoon. Thank you so much, Andrew. We give you a great round of applause, and we'll hope to see you at other events in the future. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.